My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.
This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Creating really great retail experiences with multiple stores, teams, and workflows is tough. But with Shopify's point-of-sale system, you can do it across thousands of locations without complexity. It's a unified command center, bringing together in-store and online operations so customers can shop how they want, and staff have the tools to close every sale. Check out shopify.com/special offer and create the best retail experiences without complexity.
This is Addiction Medicine Journal Club. I'm Dr. Sonya Tredici.
And I'm Dr. John Keenan.
We believe that addiction is a disease that can be treated, and we want to help you stay up to date with the latest research that you can use in your addiction medicine practice. This podcast offers Category 1 CME credit through MyCares and Michigan State University, and the links for the CME, as always, are in the show notes. This week, we're going to be discussing an article about quit attempts. So, John, how are you doing tonight?
I'm doing great. I think we were talking beforehand, just kind of very eagerly watching the RFK confirmation hearing today. So I certainly raised my blood pressure a bit.
Oh my gosh, it's too much. My blood pressure would raise too much. My blood pressure went sky high through the roof talking to Walmart yesterday, and I need like only calming things to bring it down.
How about you? How's life been treating you?
Life is going very well. Everything is good. So, John, is there anything in the news about addiction medicine you want to share with our audience?
Yeah, I thought this was kind of interesting. You know, the FDA's had it again. This article's titled U.S. Regulators Propose Capping Nicotine in Cigarettes at Non-Addictive Levels. And it's from Reuters from 2025 in January. And it's basically, once again, the FDA is trying to kind of attack tobacco companies. This way, instead of kind of like putting bans on certain components, they're actually targeting the nicotine levels. So I didn't actually know kind of what the levels currently were, but I do have many patients. Like I've never had a patient that smokes American Spirit cigarettes. Sorry for using a brand name, but that's a natural tobacco product. It's not manipulated. There's no chemical additives. And people that have smoked it, they told me it tastes disgusting. It's awful. And so a lot of our kind of current nicotine use is because these cigarettes contain nicotine far exceeding that of the naturally occurring strands through engineering, chemical processing, additives. And our current nicotine level in cigarettes is anywhere from 8 to 20 milligrams per cigarette. So there's a new cap that they're proposing that would actually decrease that to 0.7 milligrams per gram, which would actually kind of like reduce them to a level that theoretically, at least based upon some medical literature, would make them not addictive because the level's so low that you wouldn't be in high enough dose. And so, you know, the proposal's been raised more than once, kind of first in 2017, but they're kind of revisiting this. I think it's interesting, you know, they're talking about just the fact that they continue to kind of, even though like we know that cigarettes are bad for you, we have a dwindling audience of smokers. They're still kind of like rising new smokers at a lower rate, but it's still occurring. And it's kind of fueling not only issues with tobacco use and kind of tobacco related complications, but, you know, it's a major carcinogen related to atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. And the FDA did a modeling of this, and I thought it was interesting that they said that actually by changing the concentration, their modeling predicted that about 48 million youth or young adults would be preventing from initiation of smoking or from becoming chronic smokers with this changeover. And that about 12.9 million smokers would quit within a year. So I thought it was a very interesting way of kind of addressing this.
I wonder if people would switch to vaping now that you can purchase all these nicotine products, you know, in every form, basically everywhere. I wonder if people would go to that.
I mean, probably, but I mean, it's better. I mean, I think we've reviewed this now a couple times, right? In terms of harm reduction, I'd be happier dealing with a bunch of vaping in my office than my 2 and 3 pack a day smokers.
Oh, totally. Oh my gosh. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, you know. I mean, there's all kinds of ways we could be managing tobacco. use. And that would definitely be one. I mean, I wonder what the tobacco industry has to say about that.
It's interesting. My brother he's very granola, and I love him to death. But he's really into kind of healthy eating and kind of food additives, that type of kind of culture, which is really in the news a lot. I didn't realize that a lot of these tobacco companies have actually, they now have kind of food manufacturing ties that are pretty heavy. So it seems like their industry is shifting a little bit over to processed foods, which is kind of an interesting changeover.
Yeah, I mean, I've been reading for a long time that the tobacco industry, I mean, they're happy to sell cigarettes to Americans, but that's not where they're putting their sort of future plans in. They're selling cigarettes in the developing world, and then they're pivoting to processed foods as a harder thing to regulate, but equally addictive and profitable.
Well, how about you? What's been new in addiction news for you?
Well, so much, so much. No, I hope the FDA does get on this thing. I mean, I think that'd be great. I'd be really interested to see what happens and how people would respond to that. No, I had a thing. It isn't really current events, but it was an article I really liked, and we won't present it on the podcast because it's more of a review article. But I wanted to share it with you and with our audience and get your take on this. It's a systematic review from the Journal of Addictive Behaviors, and it's about exercise and cravings. So they did a meta-analysis of all the good studies about cravings for substance use disorder and exercise. And so they found 26 studies, high quality studies, and of those, 22 showed a positive outcome in reducing cravings with exercise. And interestingly, aerobic exercise was much more effective than resistance training. So the studies that profiled aerobic exercise were almost all positive, whereas the ones that used resistance training, most of them did not show a benefit. And people liked the studies, like the participants, the dropout rate was very low. Overall, people really stuck with it. And so it was a great meta-analysis, and it it was very positive. So, John, do you ever recommend exercise for people who are dealing with cravings? And if so, do people ever actually try to exercise as a way to manage cravings?
I don't do exercise as craving management, although we have covered this before. I think probably one of the sub articles I remember you've presented before. Um, but I do kind of like, I feel like I have like the phases of recovery with people. It's like kind of acute withdrawals, the first thing we get through. Then it's kind of like assessing for medical comorbidities, either based upon just their age, gender, or ejection, or substance related complications. And then, after a couple months, you quickly kind of get all that under control if someone's following up and working with you. And then I do shift over to kind of lifestyle and kind of like healthy living parts of recovery. And I often do talk about kind of things like smoking cessation, getting enough sleep, kind of like stress mitigation. But exercise, I talk about as kind of incorporating into your life as kind of a kind of a meaningful status of recovery for these people. Just like anyone else. Like, I'm a primary care doctor. We love our counseling.
We love exercise, but you don't recommend it specifically if a patient says, "I'm having a lot of cravings."
I have not. But you know what? Should I? Maybe. Probably, from what you just said.
Yeah, I mean, it's an intervention that's cheap, it's available to everybody, it's doesn't have any adverse effects, you don't have to deal with a judgy pharmacist, to get it, and it's according to this meta-analysis, it's effective. You can tell I'm still mad about this Walmart thing, but,
This pharmacist really got you going, huh?
oh, don't get me started. But anyway, yeah, and I have recommended it to people. I have people who are struggling with cravings or with, anxiety, and especially who are not in the very earliest phases of recovery. They will have been stable on buprenorphine for a few months. Things have stabilized a little bit, and then they're like, "I have cravings. What should I take?" Or more comes out, "I had cravings, so I took extra buprenorphine." And I'm like, "Okay, well, that's great. I'm glad you didn't relapse, as a, an okay way to manage it." But like, there are other ways, like, people don't seem to me to be super interested in hearing about other ways to manage cravings, and that's the same in primary care all the time, like, people are not interested in hearing about ways to manage hypertension, diabetes, high cholesterol, or rather they like hearing about it, but they don't put it into action.
See, I feel like my group that talks about like cravings after kind of the acute withdrawal stabilization period, I feel like the scenario is very similar. It's, I'm doing good. I'm going to my meetings or whatever is meaningful recovery for me. I'm now working, I started working double shifts at Amazon warehouse 3 times, 6 days a week, and I'm tired at the end of the day. And so I have cravings and I take extra. I don't know if the 70-hour work week is the etiology of their cravings. They're going to want to bite on exercise, but yeah, I'm going to try it.
Yeah, I mean, it's the like, what do you do when you have cravings? I think our friend Dr. Casey Grover, we had talked about this. I forget if it was on air or not, but he tries to shift people from what do you take when you feel negative feelings to what do you do when you feel negative feelings? Um, and one of the things to do is aerobic exercise. So I'm going to keep encouraging it with people, and I'll see if anybody takes me up on it. I mean, no one's ever like, "Gosh, that's a terrible idea. Exercise is probably not gonna help." They sort of agree, "Oh, yeah, that would be great," but then they don't really put it into practice. That's my struggle.
Okay. We'll see how that goes. You can do that next year at the Not One More recovery run.
I think I skipped it this past year. I think I had to be somewhere else.
You did. I was there.
All right. If I can come this year, I will, and we'll run together. You can pass me on that big hill.
Okay. Sounds good.
So, are you ready to talk about this article?
Yeah, this is like a very practical article for counseling. Again, kind of back to what we were just talking about. It's called Beyond the First Try: How Many Quit Attempts Are Necessary to Achieve Substance Use Cessation? And it's from Drug and Alcohol Dependence from December 2024. So, background, I think we all have characterized substance use disorder as a chronically relapsing disorder, often requiring multiple attempts to maintain abstinence. There's high recurrence rate, and that suggests that several attempts are often needed to quit and to be successful. And oftentimes, kind of high recurrence rate, multiple quit attempts, people feel frustrated, like certain things aren't working for them, right? I think that people feel like there are certain pathways are ineffective. Research on quit attempts is mostly limited to smoking cessation at this point in time, but we do know that addictive potential varies by substance, with some definitely requiring more attempts than others. Treatment outcomes are definitely variable by substance use, with many of the data sources kind of supporting that, like, for example, cannabis use being more effective than things like cocaine use or stimulant use disorder in terms of discontinuation and success rates. One study that they found that they cite in this article had about 5.35 quit attempts for successful abstinence from alcohol and other drugs. And it was kind of like this conglomerate composite score of quit attempts. Previous studies have found no significant differences in quit attempts based on primary substance, although polysubstance use really wasn't examined. And I think that for the most part, I'm not sure what you see, but I often very seldom see a kind of a monosubstance use disorder at this point. So it's hard kind of mix and matching different substances, what really is kind of your quit rate. While individuals with polysubstance use tend to have worse treatment outcomes, factors like age of onset, duration of use, severity of use disorder may also influence quit attempts, although the exact mechanism of the relationship really kind of remains unclear at this point in time. So the clinical question here is, how many quit attempts are needed to achieve successful abstinence from a substance use disorder? And number two, what variables are associated with the number of quit attempts before achieving successful abstinence from substance use disorder? What do you think about those clinical questions, Sonya? Do they seem relevant to your care?
Totally relevant. And like you said, I'm often telling patients, on average, people take 7 or 8 times to quit smoking before they're successful. I've never been able to say that with substance use disorder because I haven't had that data. So I think it's really cool to have it. And it gives people hope that, like, there's already the concept that relapse is part of the process. Like, if you relapse, it doesn't mean you're a failure. You're just on that road to recovery. Um, but this could give people a little bit of I don't know, just a thought of where they stand in terms of what's normal. I mean, if it takes 10 times on average to quit using opioids and someone has 2 relapses, you can say, "Hey, you're still doing better than average," you know? And it also helps you, like, I don't know, we've really moved away from the all or nothing model of recovery. And so if it's known kind of how people move through that pathway of recovery, it helps normalize these different paths for people. Something interesting, I'm kind of neurotic, you might know, and I keep, like, a lot of spreadsheets and stuff. And one of my spreadsheets is every patient I've ever treated with buprenorphine. And when I first started, I was keeping a list of, like, how long I was able to treat them with clean urine drug screens before they relapsed. Um, and that was my, like, success rate. And then so many people I've, been doing buprenorphine for, I don't know, like 14 years or something. So many people have been going away and then coming back and going away and coming back over that time. Now I've given up on like what counts as being in treatment. I just have like the date of their first visit with me and the date of the most recent visit with me. And that's my concept of like duration in treatment. So the longer I've been around, the more of those quit attempts I've seen people go through. So yeah, I'm really interested. Sorry, that was a bit of a long-winded answer to your question.
That's okay. That was a lot of great feedback. So let me tell you a little about this study. So this was a cross-sectional observation study. It involved 421 participants. Data was collected through online surveys with Qualtrics survey software from participants of the International Quit and Recovery Registry. That's called the IQRR. The data collection took place specifically in August of 2023. So a little bit about this database. The IQRR is an online recovery community for adults aged 18 and above, consisting of approximately 4,000 participants who meet lifetime criteria for at least one substance use disorder and self-reported being in recovery from any substance use disorder. So they have to have at least one substance use disorder criteria diagnosis, and they have to be in recovery from at least one. It could be more, it could be less, but it has to be at least one. All IQRR participants were invited to participate in this survey, and they defined absence in this questionnaire as answering no to the question, do you still use? And then it was X substance. So whatever substance it was, and they gave a list of the different substances. And that was their marker of abstinence. Inclusion criteria was, as we said, adults aged 18 and above who met lifetime criteria for at least one substance use disorder. Participants self-reported being in recovery from at least one substance. Participants also reported successful absence from at least one substance were included in the study. So those are the three inclusion criteria. Exclusion, participants with inconsistent age-related response. So basically someone that responds, some like outlier, like they first used heroin at age 4 or 6, or when they had like an age of first quit attempt higher than current age. So basically like, they quit 50 years ago, but they're only 40 years old. So things like that were inconsistent. They also threw out these kind of in extremist numbers where, subjects would kind of report like, I've tried to quit 1,000 times or some sort of like very in extremist number. So they kind of excluded those as well. And they used a cutoff kind of somewhat arbitrarily. It sounds like a 100. The primary outcomes was the number of quit attempts per substance. They did key variables where they looked at substance, the specific substance that the participants reported using. They looked at what someone, quote, is their primary substance, which I always find very interesting kind of in clinical care. What a patient identifies as their primary substance, and then kind of looking objectively at kind of what substance has caused the most complications in their health and in their social and societal functioning. So sometimes it's not always the same what their quote identity is. The primary, we said primary substance, the number of lifetime substance use disorders, so how many different substances do they meet criteria for. They looked at DSM-5 criteria for substance use disorder. Was that substance mild, moderate, or severe? They looked at the number of substances that someone was in recovery from. So both, they looked at like kind of a numeric and binary variable. They looked at age of first use for each substance, years of substance use. So basically how many years they were actively using a substance before they quit. And they did kind of multiple different kind of regression analysis, kind of looking at comparison to see which of these variables modulated the number of quit attempts. What do you think of the trial?
I thought it was good, interesting survey. I think it'd be great to have a little bit of objective data. There's problem with survey data, especially if you're trying to remember how many quit attempts you had. I think for some people that time of quitting and relapsing can be a little foggy. But, it's pretty good. I don't know if there's another way to get this data, so.
Yeah, I think that this is really kind of just like raw data. Like this is what the numbers are for your information of this group, at least. So you can kind of use it as you like. The study was supported by the Fralin Biomedical Research Institute. The authors had several financial disclosures. I think nothing that would have altered kind of the integrity of the data. So HealthSim, Beam Diagnostics, a Red 5 group, Ria Health, Lumanity, Indivior. It was a moderately sized cross-sectional observational study of 421 participants. So like we discussed, there's no control group. It's just observational reporting that point in time. The data was obtained from self-reported surveys of past events. Like these were like anonymous and like, de-identified. So you think people would be pretty honest. Although any kind of survey data is really subjective to reporting bias. And kind of there is a lot of interesting literature in addiction about kind of reporting bias for substance use disorders. And I've seen conflicting things about how historically, like for example, people with alcohol use disorder historically have a substantially reduced reporting of how much they're actually consuming. And for example, patients' kind of mean criteria for opioid use disorder, there's data about kind of over-reporting volume of use or how much. So it's kind of interesting that there is kind of data that does support that there's probably a little more reporting bias in this particular area than other things, especially with a per substance variability. They did extensive data cleaning. So we talked about some of that exclusion criteria, and 18% of participant data was excluded from analysis initially. Data was collected at one point in time, as we talked about, and you kind of talked about with your story there. Really kind of recovery is a continuum where like just that point in time may not reflect someone's entire recovery journey. So there could be kind of times where there's further relapse and discontinuation. So it may not be all encompassing. I really think that the recovery, this is kind of a thing that I know we're going to get into in another article later on a different episode, but recovery was defined as abstinence. And I think that this binary definition of recovery is really just not in favor anymore, right? I think more and more a urine drug screen result or like, do you use X? It's not that way anymore, right? I think it's gone to more of a functional definition than kind of a binary definition. So this really didn't kind of report on metrics like wellness, quality of life. It really just was whether someone was using. So really, not true recovery, more so just quit attempts to stop a substance.
Right. It's more of like abstinence. How does it take? How many quit attempts does it take to achieve drug abstinence, which is for most people, a major part of recovery. So it's not totally distinct, but recovery is never a goal that you achieve. It's more of a state. It's like a process.
Yeah.
More of an identity for a lot of people.
I didn't get to the demographics yet, but interestingly, this group was a predominantly white female group with internet access. And this does not represent kind of our typical population that we kind of talk about with most of the studies kind of on this podcast, right? Typically, we have a male predominant group, typically with low SES status, a high rate of homelessness. So like this is a group that kind of self-selects for, there's more females than our typical cohort, but also just to have access to the internet, I mean, it would allude to a higher socioeconomic status than our typical study. So it may not reflect kind of what you're seeing in the clinic, but still kind of useful information. They didn't look at concurrent factors like medication use, behavioral health involvement, inpatient versus outpatient services. All of these things can affect quit attempt success. So it would have been interesting to see if they were kind of involved as well. Although, like I said, it was a survey data, it went through many substances. At some point, I guess the survey was getting kind of long, and you can't ask a question for everything.
Yeah, you got to cut it off at some point, or people would just aren't going to fill out your endless survey.
Yeah, I do think there's a little bit of survey burnout. So good for them for responding here.
Thanks, people. We appreciate it.
So results here. So in terms of the demographic, the mean age was 43.8. Most were women, 63.7%. 85.6% were white. 86% met DSM-5 criteria for 2 or more substances. So this was a polysubstance group. The most lifetime substance use disorders were alcohol, cannabis, nicotine, or kind of a combination of the above. In terms of the specific substance use and recovery, the highest quit attempts were reported in alcohol, opioids, and nicotine in that order, with a mean quit attempts of 10.9 for alcohol, opioids of 10.4, and nicotine of 7.5. The lowest mean quit attempts was hallucinogens with 3.9 mean quit attempts. In terms of age of first use, the youngest was alcohol and nicotine, the oldest stimulants. So alcohol and nicotine age of first use had a mean of 14.6 years. And then stimulants had 23.5 years of age for first use. So kind of those are the outliers there. In terms of years of use, in terms of length of mean, the highest was nicotine with 23.8 years. The lowest was anesthetics, which at 8 years. And in terms of years since last use, there was a shorter temporal association between kind of the survey data and last use for alcohol at 7.7 years, and the longest was inhalants of 17.8 years. What do you think of just kind of those kind of like that mean data about quit attempts, kind of which ones were earliest use, which ones were kind of the longest use, which ones required the most attempts? Does that kind of reflect what you think in clinical practice?
Yeah, totally. I mean, that statistic about quitting, how many times you have to quit smoking after, to be successful, about 7 is what I've heard from other studies. And I know alcohol is super hard to quit because it's everywhere. It's very hard to separate yourself from alcohol, and opioids are super hard to quit because they're just so darn addictive and withdrawal is so intense. And I'm not surprised about hallucinogens because there's not that like tolerance and withdrawal part of hallucinogens. So um, it may make that easier to quit. So I'm not surprised. Um, age of first use, alcohol, nicotine, 14.6 years. I'm not surprised. It's just depressing, but not surprising.
Yeah, I think it does reflect what I see in the office, right? I see a lot of alcohol, opioids, nicotine. Interesting. I don't think I've ever had a patient in the office complaining to me of a problem with hallucinogens or anesthetics, but I mean, I'm sure they're out there. And inhalants, right? Even though they're out there, I don't hear people like seeking help from me at least.
Well, right. I mean, that's the thing. There's selection bias in your patient population because we don't have tools necessarily to help people with those things that are as powerful as with alcohol, nicotine, and opioids. Like those are the three that we really can make a difference in.
Yeah. Yeah, but as a primary care doc, right? I mean, people come to me all the time with problems that I've like, there are problems that have nothing to do with their health, right? They just have a problem. They come in and they want to talk with me about it. And I think sometimes we're just there to listen. I don't know. I think people feel comfortable to chat. I'm just surprised I've never encountered that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So let's talk about factors affecting quit attempts. So in terms of significant factors, kind of the statistically significant factors that influence the number of quit attempts for these substances was the following: substance type, substance use disease severity, age of first use, and years of use. And it's actually interesting when they reanalyze this, throwing in those extreme outliers, like I've tried to quit, alcohol 150 times. Actually, the results were pretty consistent. So, they did throw that out, but when they did kind of the sensitivity analysis, it shows that there's probably track regardless of whether you kind of add in this in extremis data. So in terms of comparing, let's talk at number one. So quit attempts by substance. So pain medications and opioids has statistically significantly more quit attempts than the other substances. So opioids and pain medications required more quit attempts. Alcohol and stimulants had statistically significant more quit attempts than cannabis, cocaine, hallucinogens, and nicotine. So kind of pain medications, opioids, alcohol, followed by alcohol and stimulants. And then, kind of at the lower end the lowest was hallucinogens, but tranquilizers had slightly more quit attempts. So, it kind of very much so reflects what I think most of us see here. And interestingly, like whether it was pain medication, opioids, or kind of what like street opioids, there wasn't really a difference here, which I thought was interesting, at least in this kind of analysis, or at least this reported results. In terms of quit attempts by substance use disease severity, moderate substance use disorder had more quit attempts than mild, and that was statistically significant. Severe substance use disorder had more quit attempts than mild or moderate substance use disorders. In terms of quit attempts by first age of use, there's a negative correlation that was statistically significant between age of first use and quit attempts. So earlier first use required more quit attempts. And then in terms of quit attempts by years of use, there was a positive correlation between years of use and quit attempts. So more years of use, more quit attempts. So really kind of a lot of probably your kind of clinical gestalt here is kind of confirmed by this. So kind of pain medications and opioids require the most quit attempts, kind of followed by alcohol, stimulants. In terms of substance use disease severity, higher substance use disease severity, more quit attempts required. In terms of age of first use, people using substances at younger age had more quit attempts. And then quit attempts by years of use, longer use resulted in more necessity for more quit attempts.
Now, a question. They may have addressed this in like the statistical section of the article. I'm not sure, but like I sometimes think all those significant factors are already related. Like they're not independent. So like severity of your substance use disorder, how young you were when you first started, how long you've been using, those are probably already correlated, right? I don't know,
What do you
but
think
I'm
so?
guessing they're already correlated. So it's like those aren't four independent factors, all of which are correlated with more quit attempts. They're kind of all correlated with each other. And like you said, it's your clinical gestalt of what is more significant and severe substance use disorder, and all of that takes more quit attempts.
Yeah. I mean, that's probably fair. I would say that I I will start by saying I was the statistics TA in a medical school, so I have some degree of something. But when you get into the statistical analysis, it does look like it was quite complicated how they were kind of analyzing this to also kind of compare multiple comparisons against one another. So I'm sure that like if the author's listening, they could probably justify. I bet you they did kind of tease these apart. While clinically they do, I bet you they did do statistical adjudication.
Yeah, I hear you about the statistics. I was not the statistics TA, but I was a math major in college, and I'm married to a mathematician who knows a lot about statistics, and so I'm ashamed of my lack of statistic knowledge. And one of these days, I'm going to take a class in statistics. Not going to be this year, but someday.
I was very proud. The 3 semesters that I was the statistics TA, we not one student didn't pass the class.
I'm waiting for the medical community to switch over to all like Bayesian statistics, and then I can just learn those. And I don't want to have to learn it twice. So I'm going to wait right now. I'm holding off till we've all settled on like the Bayesians.
All right. So kind of will these results help me in patient care? So like I really, the longer I've been a doctor, the more I've been doing primary care, I really feel that managing expectations, I spend more and more time with patients doing this than probably anything else. It's probably the part of my practice in the office that has expanded the most because it really kind of just sets the bar for your whole relationship and what you want to do moving forward. A common frustration for patients, for family members, and then also for clinicians in the medical community is that, a lot of this group, we see them a lot. They've quit many times before, tried many times before. And I think people feel that because past attempts have been unsuccessful, that future attempts are futile. And I think that's not the case at all. And I think that this really kind of lends support to this. And this kind of like feeling of futility, I think often leads to like disengagement by kind of like healthcare practitioners because they feel like kind of previous treatments were ineffective. Like there's nothing else to offer. So why try something again? So I think kind of whatever the disease is, whether it's depression, opioid use disorder, CHF, diabetes, really kind of letting people know what's expected for disease course, what's expected in terms of kind of like how hard it's going to be to get to the next step, what to expect in terms of relapse, if that's a predictable point. I think that's really important to align patients, families, and the healthcare teams. So like this is a small study. There's some limitations in terms of the data. I think that kind of having like some counseling with some of my patients, be like, hey, I'm gonna let you know, I know you tried to quit alcohol. The studies show that on average, it's going to take the average person 10 times of trying to quit to stop. Keep at it. I think that's really positive stuff to tell people that are often defeated and need some kind of like a pick-me-up that they're in the right direction. I'm going to use the information. I've already used it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's the same, like I've got some people coming in tomorrow who are really frustrated with themselves about how they're not being successful the way they want. And just to say like, hey, you're right in the middle of it and your experience is pretty typical. You're not worse than everybody else. You're doing a perfectly good job sticking with it. So yeah, I think it's very valuable. And on the bigger sense, you're not just counseling individual patients. It's also very valuable for like a more systemic policies and designing programs and funding programs. Like I've had patients where they've struggled and, staff or other people have been like, what are we doing here? Why don't we just like get rid of this guy? Treatment's not working. And this gives a little more credence to the fact that like it hopefully will work eventually, you know? Just stick with the patient and get them through these various attempts and hopefully they'll succeed. Well, John, thank you for presenting that article. It was really great, and I hope our audience enjoys it. I do have one talkback comment I wanted to share on this episode. So we received a very nice email from Dr. Billy Burrow, who has what sounds like an awesome job. He's a pediatrician at the Alameda County Juvenile Center at connected to UCSF Children's Hospital, and he works with youth. And he sent us a really interesting email about urine drug screens. And so before I read his comment, just to remind our audience, we had presented some articles about an article about whether urine drug screens are really useful, like what's the clinical benefit of urine drug screens. And it's a conversation we've been having on and off all year, both amongst the two of us and in our health system overall. So Dr. Burrow's comment says, I wanted to thank you for the conversation around urine drug screens in episode 45. I'm a pediatrician that works in a juvenile justice center and have been questioned for not performing urine drug screens in our facility with more regularity as I developed our MOUD program. My patient population performs random urine drug screens with a probation officer that's often met with a punitive response, i.e. longer time in a facility or on probation. Despite my reassurances that any test ordered by our medical team would be met with a leaning into care and protected from the legal system, the reality is my patients have lived in the broken system and have had reassurances in the past fall through. I decided that requiring urine drug screens was not worth the potential barrier to accessing treatment and unlikely to lead me to change my treatment plan based on their story and clinical picture. With that being said, on the rare times when probation's urine drug screen results are shared with me, it did lead to a more targeted discussion around safety, e.g. patient positive fentanyl despite being convinced that their pills were real. So I do see the benefit for these purposes, which does give me something to consider. And then he says, our current practice is to order urine drug screens for signs of intoxication or withdrawal that doesn't clinically match what we already know from their history, which is a very limited use of the urine drug screens, right? So done with his comment, using them as a fact-finding tool when the patient's clinical picture is really in doubt. But I think it was interesting. So John, where are you standing right now on urine drug screens in your office?
I can be honest here.
Yes.
Yeah,
You can be honest. Nobody's listening. It's just you and me. Just you and me right now. Just kidding.
You know what I do is I have it's like a random number generator, and I randomly generate numbers, and I just kind of grab patients kind of randomly. I used to do them on everyone, so now I won't say the percentage, but there's a percentage of people I randomly get at each visit, and then if I have suspicion or concern, then I'll get an additional one.
I think that's good. I mean, I think it's nice to have a method that's free of sort of personal bias, either for everybody or for nobody, or only in very clearly defined criteria, or randomly, which doesn't select for patients who you particularly like or don't like. Actually, I stole that method. I feel like in my clinic, I can only handle a certain number per day of urine drug screens because my clinician just doesn't have the ability to do so many urine drug screens. They take a little while. So we figured out how many she thinks she can handle in a session. And then we randomly assign a subset of those and leave it at that. So
it's funny, like ours, it's like looks like a Jeopardy wheel. It's some app that my clinician uses, and it looks very bright and like almost like epilepsy inducing. And like one of the supervisors was there, like I guess was like, "What? You can't be playing games at work." I'm like, Chloe's doing very important work. Leave her alone.
I just Googled random number generator and Google has one. Oh my gosh. Yeah, I it's interesting. It's a great topic and more to come, I'm sure, as the standards around addiction treatment continue to evolve. So that's it. Thank you everyone for listening to the Addiction Medicine Journal Club. The best part of any journal club is the conversation, and we want to hear what you have to say. To have your opinions about the articles included in a future episode, send us your comments on social media, email, or join our Facebook group. The links will be in the show notes. Our original theme music was composed and performed by Benjamin Kennedy, audio editing by Michael Bonanno, CME support from MyCares, produced by Dr. Patrick Beeman and Ars Longa Media. Addiction Medicine Journal Club is intended for educational purposes only and should not be considered medical advice. The views expressed here are our own and do not necessarily reflect those of our employers or the authors of the articles we review. All patient information has been modified to protect their identities. Thank you for being part of the conversation and have a great day.